All right, hello everyone. Happy New Year. Today's Monday, January 4th. We're going to begin a week of Greek mythology. It's usually a fun one, and after today's lesson, it will focus on a project for you guys. So today, by the end of this lesson, you'll be able to identify Greek mythology and what that definition means, reasons for myth stories, and ways that the ancient Greeks honored the gods. Okay. So first is our definition of Greek mythology. So mythology is a body or a collection of stories about gods and heroes that try to explain how the world works. And the key here is this collection of stories exists because they didn't know how the world works. The ancient Greeks, like all ancient people, they did not have modern science to explain why things in the natural world occurred. And so when you sit with Miss O'Donnell and you're in person or online and she's giving you lessons about earthquakes, volcanoes, things that are happening in the world, she's teaching you more information, more science, more knowledge than the people in ancient Greece and in all of the ancient world had. So you're already ahead of people that were in the ancient world. You know more than they did. That's why you might look at Greek mythology and think it's silly stories, because you know, because of science and because of specifically Miss O'Donnell, you know exactly why things occur in the world. These people didn't, and it was terrifying to them. And so in some way they had to explain, to keep themselves from driving themselves crazy with fear, they tried to explain why these things occurred. For instance, lightning. When you're a little kid, it's pretty scary. Now you know exactly why it's occurring. The ancient Greeks didn't have that scientific explanation, so they said lightning was explained by a god, the king of all gods, the father of all gods, Zeus, throwing lightning bolts. Okay, earthquakes, pretty scary. Earth-shattering earthquakes. We had one about a month and a half ago in Dartmouth, Newport, Westport, New Bedford. Earthquakes are scary, and we know why they happen now. And I think you've already talked about that with Miss O'Donnell. They didn't know why earthquakes were happening, and if you remember, both the Minoan and Mycenaean civilizations collapsed to a degree because of violent earthquakes in this region. So it's really a big part of their lives, and they were caused by Poseidon when he was angry. That's how they explained those things away. Okay, so mythology is a body of stories to explain away scientific things that are occurring in the natural world, in nature, that they just couldn't explain. And that's just a couple of short analogies as to why. So what is a myth? Mythology. Mythology is that scientific idea, okay? Ology always means science. So the science of myths, now you know what the myths were created for. So what is a myth? A myth is a traditional story, especially one concerning or regarding or involving the early history of a people, like the ancient Greeks, and or explaining some natural, like we just discussed, or social phenomenon or events, and typically involving supernatural beings or events. And so that supernatural beings that are being discussed, that would be the gods and goddesses. So when we watched Hercules right before Christmas break, a lot of those things that he was doing were supernatural. They were outside of the normal. And he was considered, obviously, as you know from the story, to be partially a god. Okay? And so as a review, as we get into this here, this is our third unit where these ancient people, all ancient people that we've discussed so far, were polytheistic. They believed in polytheism. This is their form of religion, where poly means many. So it's a belief in many gods and goddesses. And that, as you know, more than one is many, is multiple. There was a god, Zeus, that controlled lightning. There was a god, Poseidon, that controlled earthquakes. And so there's lots of representations. These are more modern, kind of cutesy, cartoony, kind of like the Incredibles representation of these Greek gods and goddesses. You have Apollo, Ares, Zeus, Artemis, Dionysus, Hermes, Poseidon, we talked about, Demeter, who's in charge of the seasons, Hera, the queen and the wife of Zeus, Hephaestus, who is the guy that is responsible for earthquakes. For volcanoes, because of the myth of him creating weapons and shields for and armor for the gods and goddesses. Aphrodite of love, that's hearts around her. Athena, the warrior goddess. Okay, and this is just a very small number. And we'll spend the week researching them and doing a project on them. There are other ways, more modern like this, of representing these, this is Medusa, of representing these gods and goddesses and these monsters and these heroes. And then there's the very classical way of showing where they lived on Mount Olympus, kind of looking like normal people. There's some angels flying around, but you can see the difference in how they are represented over the course of history. Okay, so why did the Greeks create myth stories? As I touched upon a little bit, I'll explain more now. Since the Greeks were affected by the environment around them, which we all are, even in modern times, we have snowstorms, we still have earthquakes, we have floods, we have things like that, we have heat waves, we have blizzards, and all those things happen. So since the environment was affecting them, there are storms, earthquakes, there are fires, volcanoes, the earth is the earth, natural things occur, Mother Nature occurs. This was a way that they explained them. They explained these natural occurrences, some of which are extremely scary. I mean, an earthquake's scary. Massive fires can be really devastating and scary, and they happen quick. The fires in California, when they're really spreading fast, they can spread by 3 football fields in a matter of seconds. I mean, you can't outrun that. Volcanoes are very terrifying. I mean, the earth rattles. We've talked about volcanoes with Thera, ending the Minoan civilization, lava and the pyroclastic clouds coming out of them, the ash falling on people. It's terrifying. And so they explained these terrifying events and tried to understand them by believing that the gods had control over them and had caused these events for a number of reasons, sometimes out of anger, like Poseidon and earthquakes. So these gods also played a role in their daily lives. It wasn't just things in the environment they couldn't explain, but it was other things that they believed they didn't have control over. Someone had to have control over them. So things like love, war, okay, death, something that they couldn't explain, the sun and the moon, why it's light at one part of the day and the moon's out and it's dark another time of the day, agriculture, and then the seasons. Okay, and many other occurrences in their daily lives. They believed that the Greek gods and goddesses were tampering with their lives, with the events that occurred. And so, if this is true and they have all of this immense power to impact literally your daily lives, what do you want to do to keep them happy? Answer: probably anything in your power to keep them happy. Okay, so how did they worship these gods? Okay, so the Greeks built temples to them. They built temples to these gods and goddesses to try to keep them happy and to honor them on earth. Okay, a way to honor them on earth, and to honor and respect their power that they had, whether it's the power to, destroy a civilization with earthquakes and volcanoes and floods like the Minoans, or whether it's to win a war. Whatever it might be, they wanted to keep these people happy. If you don't have food, and the goddess of agriculture and the seasons isn't happy, doesn't play ball with you, basically, that can wipe out thousands and millions of people with starvation. Okay, and so the gods were believed to live on top of Mount Olympus, which is the highest point on the mainland of Greece that we studied a month ago when we began the unit. And why? It's sort of the idea of the heavens is unattainable. It's a location that not many Greeks could go to, if any at the time. It's very high. It's a very high point, obviously the highest point on mainland Greece. They're living up it's kind of like they're living up in the sky. This is their home. Okay. Another way that they worship them, which is pretty cool, that still affects or impacts our lives today, is every 4 years, the Greeks took part in the Olympics. Okay, and the Olympics were a sporting contest to honor the gods, specifically the first, which occurred in Olympia, which was a city-state in southern Greece. and they held it in honor of Zeus, and they called it the Olympic Games. And it was these competitions of the best athletes in ancient Greece. The games included, and athletes competed in foot races and running and sprints, chariot races, boxing, wrestling, and throwing events, throwing javelins and other things. Unfortunately, in ancient Greece, only men could compete, and the Greeks held these games for every 4 years for more than 1,000 years, and that ended around the 320s ACE. And there's a reason that it ended around then, and we'll get to that eventually. And then they sort of disappeared and didn't happen for a very, very, very long time. And in 1896, they took place, the first modern Olympics took place in the city of Athens, the modern capital of all of Greece, one of the major city-states that we've talked about and that we'll continue to talk about. Okay? Men and women of all nations that want to participate can participate in these events. I'm sure you've watched them. The Summer Olympics and the Winter Olympics happen every 4 years, and so they're always 2 years apart. So the Summer Olympics were supposed to happen this past summer in 2020, and obviously the pandemic changed that. But the Summer Olympics are set to occur this summer, starting July 23rd, in the same location they were last summer, in Tokyo, Japan. So that's pretty cool, and that's something that you can watch this summer, and now you'll know exactly why these events are happening. It's not just for nations and athletes to compete and honor themselves and their nations, but originally these games occurred as a way to worship. So in review here, mythology is a body of stories about gods and heroes that try to explain the world around them that they don't understand, the natural world around them. A myth is exactly this, a story to explain the early history of people and people that had supernatural abilities that were gods and goddesses and heroes. Some were humans that were heroes, that were the best of the best at that time period, or the best of the best in their history. Some might have been based on actual people. Some were based on complete stories and myths. They were explaining the environment around them that they didn't understand, that was oftentimes violent and incredibly powerful. It was a way to have some control. I mean, how do you control when an earthquake or a volcano will happen? You have none. So in the ancient world, the control that they had was where they could worship and honor these gods and goddesses and hope that they were doing so by building temples and having competitions and keeping them happy. Today, we have a little control over when they'll occur because scientifically we can at times predict when they'll happen. And so that's the power that we have today. But in the ancient world, they believed the environmental, natural things that could occur and the daily things, love, war, death, agriculture, all these things occurred because the gods and goddesses had control over them. And often the word petty was used. Petty meant that they held grudges, or they had competitions between the gods and goddesses. They would have a competition, they'd make bets, and then they would each take a different side of a city-state, and those two city-states would have a war, and the god or goddess that was supporting them best would be the one that won the war. And all of these things were occurring because they didn't have control over who would win a war. They just tried their best, but believing in some supernatural power being on their side was a huge part of their religion, a foundational part of their religion. So what you're going to do now is we're going to go back into classwork for today, which is 1-4, January 4th, 2021. Feels good to say 2021. You're going to read 3 short slides of text, 18, 19, and 20 on the Google Slides that have been provided. And then you are going to answer some questions. Tomorrow, I'm going to spend time explaining a project to you that we will be working on for the rest of the week on Greek mythology. It should be fun.